An Introduction to Scholarly Publishing for those attending ACC 2021. Hello and welcome to this session on the publishing process. My name is Kate Hancock and I'm the Senior Publisher for the Control Engineering and Signal Processing journals at the publishing company Elsevier, based in Oxford in the UK. I publish a portfolio of journals including a number of IFAC and other control titles, in addition to several others in related fields. The goal of this presentation is to provide you as authors or future authors with a little background information on the process of academic publishing and to outline the important basic steps that you need to follow to prepare your manuscript for publication. We'll start with a brief introductory overview, which I'll skip through quite quickly to give you a feel for how publishing works, and I will follow up with more detail on preparing an article for publication afterwards in the second and third parts of the presentation, as you can see here on the agenda. The fourth part talks about using good scientific language and is particularly relevant if you happen to be a non-native English speaker. Starting with a little bit of background then, I thought I'd quickly mention peer review. So, as it says here, a central practice in academic publishing, the peer review process is the concept of evaluating articles by experts in the field. It was first used in the 17th century in Philosophical Transactions, the world's first science journal, published by the Royal Society in London in 1665. It is an established process which places the reviewer at the heart of scientific publishing. The process of peer review allows the academic community to improve the quality of scholarship and to weed out poor quality, unsubstantiated and false research. It is a testament to the power of peer review that a scientific hypothesis or statement presented to the world on its own is largely ignored by the scholarly community, as without peer review there is no quality control in scientific communication. This graph shows the number of journal titles year on year. As you can see, the peer review process continues to be a popular practice, and the number of peer-reviewed journals continues to grow and grow. Let's focus in a bit now and take a look at the process of publishing as a whole. I'll start with this diagram of the publishing cycle, so you can understand how this business works. This will be similar at lots of other large publishing houses, of course. To give you an idea about the volume of articles we're talking about and the work involved in their publication, this illustration shows how this works at my company, Elsevier. We can consider some really staggering figures. 12.6 million articles are currently archived in our system. Depending on the journal, on average, 30 to 60% are rejected directly by one of the 13,000 editors we work with. Those articles that are not rejected up front will undergo peer review. Currently, we work with around 560,000 reviewers to evaluate these articles. Of these, around half will get accepted after minor or major revision. Overall, 365,000 articles are in the end accepted by the editors each year and produced, which means typeset, posted online, linked to the various external platforms like, for instance, PubMed, promoted to the appropriate audience by our marketing teams, and of course archived for future use. 12.6 million articles are now available and have been downloaded over 700 million times by 11 million researchers across more than 120 countries. So we've had a brief look at the wider context. Now let's turn to you and what you should do if you also want to get published. First of all, are you actually ready to publish your work? Here's my advice. You should not consider publishing yet if the work is outdated, you would be duplicating previously published work, or if your conclusions are incorrect or not acceptable. These points are good indicators that your report lacks academic interest or does not substantially advance the field. However, you should consider publishing your research if you have information that does advance the understanding in a specific research field. This could take the form of presenting new original results or methods, rationalizing, refining or reinterpreting published results, or reviewing or summarizing a particular subject or field. Remember that a strong manuscript and message is crucial in order to present your contributions to the scientific community. So, what makes a strong manuscript? I'd suggest that strong manuscripts have three key characteristics, as you can see here. First, Their academic message is clear, useful and exciting. Second, their message is presented and constructed in a logical manner. They enable the reader to arrive at the same conclusions as the author, and the format chosen is the best way to showcase the material. Third, they enable readers, reviewers and editors to easily grasp the significance of the research. Remember that the more effort you put into a manuscript upfront, the more likely it is to be accepted. Editors, reviewers and readers all want to receive well-presented manuscripts that fit within the aims and scope of their journal. I'll be talking in more detail about how to prepare your paper for publication in an academic journal later. Right, there are various types of manuscripts that suit different purposes. So first of all, we'll start with full articles. They're the most frequent type. These are often substantial, complete and comprehensive pieces of research that are of significance. They are the standard paper type for disseminating completed research findings, and they're a good way to build a scientific research career. Letters or short communications are quick and early communications of significant original advances. These tend to be much more brief than full articles. Review papers summarise recent development on a specific topic, highlighting important points that have been previously reported and actually introduce no new information. These are often submitted after invitation by an editor. Reviews are a really good way to consolidate a scientific research career. Don't forget also conference papers. These are an excellent way to disseminate early or in-progress research findings and start your research career. They're typically 5 to 10 pages long, with, say, 3 figures and about 15 references. Some journals also publish short case studies or micro-articles, and also debates between authors. Before selecting an article type for your manuscript, you should first self-evaluate your work. Ask yourself the following questions. Is my message sufficient for a full article? Are my results so thrilling that they should be shown as soon as possible in a short communication? Your supervisor or colleagues are good sources of advice on manuscript type. Sometimes outsiders can see the situation more clearly than you can. You can now publish your methods, data and software as standalone articles with these new journal formats that I'm showing here on the slide. I won't go into detail on each, but for example, data in brief, that's the middle one there. This provides a way for researchers to share and reuse each other's data sets. To make your data count, all you need to do is publish your dataset description along with your submitted data. Many of my journals are linked to this particular publication. You might find this useful to bear in mind, as some authors are now asking more and more about how they can publish their research data and get credit for it, in addition to their main article. All of these new journal types are open access and they cover all subject areas. In this way, you can publish results during the course of your research before you write your final full research article. Do have a look at their websites, MethodsX, Data in Brief and SoftwareX. It's really important to select an appropriate journal so that your work will reach the intended audience. If your paper is outside the scope of a journal, it'll likely be rejected immediately by the editors, not even because of the quality of the work, but because the topic doesn't fit with the journal. Something I must stress is that it is very important that you do not gamble by submitting your manuscript to more than one journal at a time. International ethics standards prohibit multiple or simultaneous submissions, and the editors do find out. Remember that your supervisor, who is often a co-author, has co-responsibility for your work, so ask them for help. Also, ask your colleagues when you're deciding where to submit. They may be more familiar with the different journals that are relevant to your field. The best thing you can do is to investigate all candidate journals to find out their aims and scope, accepted types of articles, readership and current hot topics. And here's a quick tip. Articles in your own references will usually lead you directly to the right journals. Just to give you a quick example from my company, you can investigate journals by visiting their homepage on the publisher's website. For example, try using Elsevier's Journal Finder tool, which I'm shown here. And then you can go through the abstracts of recent publications yourself. One consideration for selecting a journal to submit a manuscript to may be the impact factor. The impact factor tells you how many times recent papers in one journal are cited on average in a given year. It does not give an indication about citations of individual papers. The impact factor can be influenced by the editorial policies of journals and the turnover of research in a certain field. For example, more recent citations will be made in a very fast subject area like genetics, as opposed to, say, geography, linguistics, or possibly control. Also, reviews articles are generally better cited, so journals publishing only review articles tend to have higher impact factors as well. So please be aware that when considering where you should submit your work, the impact factor can certainly give guidance, but it should not be the sole reason to submit to a journal. Okay, so some final tips in this introductory section before we move on. Editors and reviewers do not like wasting time on poorly prepared manuscripts. This is why each journal typically has a guide for authors with specific details for the preparation of your manuscript. Please apply the guide for authors to your manuscript, even to the first draft. It can help you with the text layout, reference style, details of how you should prepare your figures and tables, and many other important items. This will save you your time along with the editors and reviewers. Remember, editors can potentially be dealing with hundreds of manuscripts every year. They're very busy people. The first part of this presentation then has covered the steps to take before even beginning to write your paper. Here's a summary of what I've said so far. Determine if you are ready to publish your work by analysing the significance of your achievements. Decide on the best type of manuscript, so short communication, full original article, or have you been invited to write a review paper? Choose the target journal that is most appropriate and has the right level of audience and prestige for your level of work. Check the guide for authors for your target journal and do get details for how to prepare your manuscript from there. I'll now move on then to look in more detail at the process of properly structuring your article in order to improve its chances of being accepted. Note that this second part of the presentation is aimed at researchers in a very wide range of academic fields, scientific or more humanities-based. Some advice will therefore be more or less relevant to you personally, depending on your background, but I can always try to help with questions, and my contact details will be provided at the end. As you can see on this slide, research articles contain many sections and each one has a definite purpose. However, authors do not always structure their paper to showcase their ideas in the best possible light. At times, crucial information that reviewers look for is left undisclosed or hard to find. At the beginning are the title, abstract and keyword sections, which all play important roles in allowing the article to be easily found, indexed and advertised to potential readers. Do make these sections informative, attractive and effective so that the article is easy to index and search. The main text of the article is summarised by the IMRAD acronym: Introduction, Methods, Results and Discussion. This is where you must present your work and convey the main messages and findings effectively. Do note that the reader's time is not unlimited. Make your article as concise as you possibly can. The last group of sections brings up the end of the manuscript and includes conclusion, acknowledgments, references and supporting materials. However, these are just artificial groupings and the order can change. Some journals request the discussion section to be combined with the conclusion or results sections. Others need it to be an independent section, for example. There are also different arrangements of the order, for example, methods put after results and discussion. You should read the guide for authors, which I mentioned earlier, for the specific criteria of your own target journal. And note from what I've said here, really that the structure of your paper for the readers can be briefly summarised as going from the more general to the more specific and back out to general again, so going from a broad introduction through all the small details of the research and back out to the conclusion, which is more general. Let's look at each section then and what it contains, starting with the title. As you can see here, there are certain characteristics of effective titles. They should attract the reader's attention, contain the fewest possible words, adequately describe content, be informative but concise, identify the main issue, and not use technical jargon and abbreviations, but rather use formal language. I would certainly advise you to discuss the title with your co-authors. In general, I would also say that shorter, memorable titles are better than longer ones. Remember, editors and reviewers don't like titles that make no sense or fail to represent the subject matter adequately. And maybe even more importantly, you want the appropriate audience to read your paper. If the title isn't accurate, the right people may not read it, and the community might be unaware of your work. This could even lead to lower citations than the paper deserves. Having said that, editors and reviewers are not likely to actually reject a manuscript because of its title. In other words, the negative consequences of a poorly crafted title during the review process are minimal. However, on the positive end of the spectrum, a title does have the potential to invoke the curiosity of a reader. If accurate in reflecting the content, it helps set the expectations of a reader in terms of content and approach used. Finally, when you are planning your title, it's a good idea to draft a few alternative versions that capture the keywords related to the paper, and then select one that is the best fit and the shortest. Do retain the others in your notes though, and don't get too attached to any particular one at the start. Titles often get changed during the review process, either as key contributions become clearer or as editors and reviewers make new suggestions. Okay, on to authorship. So determining the order of authors on a paper can vary by discipline and culture, but the general rule is that the first author is the person who conducts or supervises the data collection, analysis, presentation and interpretation of the results, and also puts together the paper for submission. The corresponding author can be the first author, or sometimes it's a senior author from the institution. You should always try to avoid what we call ghost authorship, which means excluding authors who participated in the work, and also gift authorship, which means including authors who did not contribute to the work. Be consistent in how you write the authors' names too. Keywords are the labels or tags for your manuscript and are used by indexing and abstracting services. The first thing to say here is that you should avoid words that have broad meaning. Keywords should be specific enough to give someone a very quick idea about the content of your paper. Only use abbreviations that are firmly established in the field of study. So, for example, in a medical journal, they would use, as it says here, something like DNA. Check the guide for authors, again, for specifics on which keywords should be used. The box at the bottom of this slide contains actual examples of keywords that are associated with an article taken from Science Direct, our online platform. If the title catches the reader's attention, the next thing they're going to check is the abstract. The abstract, remember, is freely available in electronic abstracting and indexing services such as Scopus, PubMed, and so on and so forth. The abstract then should be a single paragraph summarising the problem, the methods, the results and the conclusions. The abstract acts really as an advertisement for your article, since it is freely available via online searching and indexing. You want to make it as catchy and accurate as possible to have the greatest impact. An abstract written clearly will strongly encourage the reader to read the rest of your paper. And a final point to note is that the abstract should really be as brief as possible. Really take your time to write the abstract very carefully. Many authors write the abstract last actually, so that it accurately reflects the whole content of the paper. Here's just a quick example of an abstract from Automatica. Next, let's look at the process of building an article. The sequence of writing the article is not the same as reading it. For most academic fields, the most efficient way is to regard the manuscript as a sort of wall and build it up brick by brick. You start with producing your tables and figures with captions and legends. Then describe the methods used, the results found, and the discussion around these results. The conclusion should flow on from this fairly easily. Then you write the introduction as to where your work fits into the field as a whole. Finally, you write the title, abstract and keywords. I would say that this process of building the article is easier, more logical and more effective than trying to write an article in the sequence that it's actually read. Okay, starting with the introduction, this is used to provide context for your manuscript and convince readers why your work advances a field of study. Some quick tips for you here. Be concise in the introduction, but give the reader enough information to understand why the work is important. Introductions of letters, of course, can be much shorter, sometimes just one paragraph. This section shouldn't be a history lesson, but you do need to introduce the main scientific publications on which your work is based. Cite a couple of original and important works, including recent review articles, to give the reader a sense of how your work fits into the literature. However, take care not to make citations to irrelevant references, including your own. Make sure you clearly address the following. What is the problem you are ultimately trying to solve? Identify the solutions and limitations. Are there any solutions? If so, what is the best solution and what are its limitations? What is your work trying to achieve? And fourthly, provide a perspective that is consistent with the journal where you're actually submitting. Although it can be tempting to reuse introductions from your previous papers on similar studies, every paper should present a new result and the work should be specifically motivated. This requires a unique introduction every time. And here, just again, a little quick example is an introduction that I've taken from the journal Automatica. Have a look at a few online yourself to get a good feel for how it should be done. The methods section describes how you studied the problem. It is important to be detailed. A knowledgeable reader should be able to reproduce the experiment from having read what you've said. Any previously published procedures should not be rewritten in detail. Those, though, can be noted in the references or described in the supporting materials sections. The equipment and materials used in experiments should be identified, along with their sources, if there is the chance for variability of quality of these items. If the work is computational or theoretical, as it will be for many of you, then code, computational or analytical methods should be described. If your work involves experiments on humans or animals, it must follow applicable ethics standards, such as the most recent version of the Helsinki Declaration and/or relevant local, national and international animal experimentation guidelines. Approval of a local ethics committee is required and should always be specified at this point in the manuscript, the covering letter or the online submission system. However, even approval of a local ethics committee does not guarantee that the editors will also agree that the work was done in an acceptable manner. Moving on to the results section, this is where you describe the important results of your research. You should present the results that are essential to the discussion, which means that only data of primary importance should be shared. Data of secondary importance should be put into the supporting or supplementary materials section. However, having said that, do not attempt to hide data in the hope of saving it up for a later paper, or split the results of one project into many papers. This dilutes the effect of the work and results in lower quality papers. You may also lose evidence that reinforces your conclusions. I would also say you should use subheadings to keep results of the same type together. This will make the results easier to review and read. Number these subsections for the convenience of internal cross-referencing. Decide on a logical order of the data that tells a clear story. Another point to note is that you should highlight findings that further understanding in the field, or those that differ from previous findings, and explain any unexpected results. Illustrations, including figures and tables, are the most efficient way to present your results. Try to think of your data as the driving force of the paper. This means that your figures and illustrations are critical, and they should be used for essential data only. The legend of a figure should be brief and it should contain sufficient explanatory details to explain the figure without the need to refer to the text. Use colour only when it's necessary. If different line styles can clarify the meaning, such as dots or dashes, then don't use colours or other exciting effects that can distract the reader from the content and won't appear in black and white print anyway. Thinking about types of figures and tables, there are a few points to consider here. Graphs are often used to compare experimental results with those of previous works or with calculated or theoretical values. Graphs should not appear crowded. Try to present at most 3 to 4 datasets per figure. Use well-selected scales, label the axes clearly, and use different symbols so that one can quickly discriminate between the datasets. Often, tables give the actual experimental results. Do not include long, boring tables unless absolutely necessary, or otherwise put them into the supplementary materials section and make them as easy to read as possible. Every photograph or image should be presented with a scale marker, and the resolution should be clear. Basically, having said all of this, what I want to say is that simplicity really is the key. So the discussion section is where you interpret what your results mean. This is the most important section of the whole article. This is where you get the chance to really sell your data. A huge number of manuscripts are rejected because the discussion is weak or only includes mere description of the results. Make sure that the discussion corresponds to and complements the results, but do not simply repeat the results here. Compare other published results with your own, and do not ignore work that's in disagreement with yours. Rather, confront it and convince the reader that your results are correct or better. As it says here, do be careful not to use the following. Things like statements that go beyond what the results can support. Non-specific expressions, such as in a scientific article, for example, something like higher temperature or at a lower rate. Try to use quantitative descriptions instead. Also, be careful not to use new terms that have not already been defined or mentioned in your paper, or speculations on possible interpretations that are based on imagination rather than rooted in fact and carefully explained in your article. One point to think about from the start: if you need to revise the results or discussion, this may involve a lot of work and require further experiments or simulations. Sometimes you may not be able to clarify your idea just in words because some critical items have not been studied substantially. Make sure your message is complete before you start writing or submit your article. And so we arrive at the conclusion. The conclusion is used to show how your work advances the field of study. Be clear in the conclusion to help the reviewers and editors judge your work and its impact. Provide clear justification for how your work advances the field. This can be achieved by indicating uses, extensions, or applications of the work. Don't just repeat the abstract here, though. The abstract and conclusion serve different purposes, although some of the same messages may be mentioned. Also, don't list the experimental results here. Trivial restatements of your results are unacceptable in this section. Finally, it's good to suggest future experiments that build on your work and point out any relevant experiments that you may already have underway. The Acknowledgments section includes the names of the important entities you want to acknowledge, such as advisors, financial supporters, and proofreaders. The reference list is where you cite the main scientific publications on which you based your work. Take note that there are many society journals that also require a conflict of interest statement, and many non-society journals today as well. These need to be placed around about the references section, often just before. Some tips for having a proper reference list are: firstly, do not include too many references, especially if they're only tangentially related to your work. Always ensure that you have fully absorbed and understood the material you're referencing. Do not just rely on reading excerpts or isolated sentences, but really know what you're referencing. Avoid excessive self-citations of your own work or from a single region or institute. And again, check that guide for authors to ensure that you're following the correct format. Presentation in the correct format is the responsibility of the author, not the editor, so just try to make the editor's work a bit easier, and they'll really appreciate that effort. Okay, so I understand that was a lot of information in a short time. So to summarise, structuring your article properly will make the work clearer and it will have a greater impact in the field. Make sure that each section of the paper fulfills its purpose clearly and concisely. Your title and abstract advertise your work and attract people to read the full article. Keywords are the labels or tags for your article that give someone a very quick idea about the content of your article and are used by indexing and abstracting services. Keywords also have impact on search engine optimization, which supports readers to find your article more quickly, so pay close attention to each word you use. The main text of the article includes introduction, methods, results, and discussion. The discussion is where you can really showcase the importance of your results and explain how they advance understanding in your field. The conclusion section is used to show how your work advances the field of study. The Acknowledgments section includes the names of the important entities you want to acknowledge, such as advisors, financial supporters, and proofreaders. The References section is where you cite the main scientific publications on which you based your work. And the Supporting Materials section includes additional information, such as previously published procedures and secondary data. So just before we move on to the final section of the presentation, a quick word about what happens next. After submitting, the time it takes for you to hear from the editor can vary depending on the journal. Assuming the paper is not desk rejected, that means rejected right away by the editor, it'll be sent out for external review by experts in the field. In my own group of journals, the average time from submission to acceptance hovers at somewhere around 30 weeks in total. And that includes several rounds of revision in which both reviewers and authors are allowed a number of weeks each to work on the papers before sending them back for further checking. The time you wait to get a first decision is a lot shorter. You should expect somewhere around, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks before hearing something. That is, whether the editor is willing to give your paper a chance. At that point, you'll receive a decision from the editor that the manuscript has been either accepted with revision, which could be minor or major, or rejected. If the article requires revision, you'll be provided with the reviewer's comments, which you can use to make modifications, and then resubmit your paper. If your manuscript is rejected, then you can note the suggestions from the editor and reevaluate if it is worth submitting your article to a different journal. And sometimes actually editors recommend alternative journals to you if they think your paper would be a better fit there. Finally, I'll just backtrack a bit and mention your covering letter when submitting to a journal. The cover letter gives you a chance to correspond directly with the journal editor. Editors won't generally reject a manuscript just because the cover letter is bad. However, a good cover letter may accelerate the editorial process of your paper, so bear that in mind. Just to whiz through a few quick points then. The cover letter is submitted alongside your manuscript. You'll want to mention what would make your manuscript special or worthwhile to the journal. Don't simply summarise your manuscript or repeat the abstract here, but you should mention why your manuscript is original and what your purpose is. Your letter should also state the final approval of all co-authors, as well as if your manuscript has been previously rejected from another journal. Thirdly, consider mentioning other special requirements such as conflicts of interest or your suggested reviewers or people who should not review. That's really helpful information to the editor. On the topic of suggested reviewers, I would say that you should emphasise that these are experts in the field, not friends of the authors. You should not have had any collaboration with these people for the past 3 years. Often journals ask for people in different countries, and it shouldn't be board members of the journal who are actually already in the reviewer pool anyway. Do think carefully about this if it's a requirement at submission stage, and show your knowledge of those active in the discipline. Here is a quick example of a good model letter. You can see that the author has explained that all authors have given their final approval. They've explained the importance of the research in the second paragraph, and then they've also suggested 3 potential reviewers that the editor might like to consider. Okay, the goal of this third section of the presentation, which is much shorter, is simply to provide a bit of advice about the importance of using proper academic language in a manuscript. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll say again here, the slides are designed for a wide audience, including non-native English speakers. I apologise if it all seems a bit too obvious to you, but it's not intended to be patronising. I hope it's useful to some of you anyway, and we'll run through it quite quickly. To start with, I would suggest that some characteristics of the best manuscript writing would be things like consistency, clarity, a lack of jargon and unexplained abbreviations, straightforward, accessible sentences, so nothing too complicated, a paper that's well structured by topic, and overall good use of English. It's important to take seriously the presentation of your manuscript, especially the language you use to communicate your results. Without clear and proper language, editors and reviewers will not grasp the full message or impact of your work. Even though the findings you report might be cutting edge, poor language quality, including errors in grammar, spelling or language usage, could delay publication or could lead to outright rejection of the paper, preventing the research from getting the recognition it really deserves. Proper English should be used throughout the entire manuscript, so that includes things like the captions and headings in figures, charts, graphs and photos. Using correct language will save your editor and reviewers the trouble of guessing what you mean, and they will thank you for it, believe me. Take a look at this complaint from an editor, who I hasten to add is not from one of the journals I work on, to see what I mean. Often, authors assume that the publisher will correct the language of their manuscript after it has been accepted, but actually this is not the case. It is the author's responsibility to make sure a paper is in the best form possible when they submit. Although publishers don't correct language, they do often provide resources for authors who are less familiar with the conventions of international journals. Please check your publisher's website for more information. Some publishers may also provide technical screening prior to peer review, and if your paper's language quality doesn't meet a journal's minimum standards, it could be returned to you for improvement. An example here, in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, shows how Elsevier can assist you with your writing through our web shop's language editing services. Do check it out, it's in the author section of elsevier.com. The key to presenting your work well is basically to write clearly, objectively, accurately and concisely. It's obvious that you should try to prevent spelling errors by using a spell checker in English, but the other most common language errors involve sentence construction, incorrect tenses, inaccurate grammar and inconsistent use of English throughout the paper. Again, you should always read the journal's guide for authors to check for any additional language specifications. To write a successful manuscript, first be aware of the sentence structure you use. Sentences should be constructed in short, factual bursts. Long and complicated sentences tend to confuse readers. Only one idea should be conveyed in each sentence, and multiple statements should be avoided in a single sentence. Do remember also that English language should be used throughout the entire manuscript. This includes figures, charts, graphs and captions for photos, so please check these carefully before submitting. You must also take care to use the proper tenses when describing your work and findings. The present tense should be used for known facts and hypotheses. The past tense should be used for describing experiments that have been conducted and the results of these experiments. Be consistent and correct in your use of tenses. This makes your paper much easier to understand for the reader. Pay special attention to the grammar used in your manuscript. One way to help make the work and results clearer for the reader is to use the active rather than the passive voice. The passive voice can be used in the methods section of a paper, but otherwise the active voice will usually shorten sentences and make them more dynamic and interesting to the reader. You should also avoid contractions such as it's, isn't or weren't, which aren't often used in professional writing, and avoid abbreviations, except for the very well-known ones, unless you have clearly defined them elsewhere within the paper. You should minimise use of adverbs, eliminate redundant phrases, and double-check unfamiliar words or phrases. So let's have a quick recap here. Remember that the overall key purpose of publishing a manuscript is to communicate your message to the research community. If your manuscript is poorly written or presented in a way that makes its message unclear, there is a risk that reviewers, editors, and readers may not understand it. To ensure that your work is comprehensible, it is essential that you use proper English language with concise sentences, correct tenses, and correct grammar. You should consult the journal's guide for authors for any additional specifications. We also recommend that you ask a native English-speaking colleague to help you edit the final version before submission, or take advantage of one of the many language editing services available today. Finally, I just want to draw your attention to a few resources that may be of use to you as authors, giving you lots of helpful advice on how to get started in your own publishing journey. Do check our website, elsevier.com, and have a look around at the wealth of brochures and webinars there for authors. The very best of luck to you now in your own academic publishing career. Just to say as we finish, feel free to contact me personally at any time for more information or advice on publishing in Elsevier's journals. I'm always happy to help. Thank you.